In this lecture, we're going to be talking some more about Freud. We're going to finish up on Freud and psychoanalytic ideas more generally. I've had a request since we, at the end of the last lecture, gave short shrift to the genital stage, a stage to which some of you seem dearly attached from what I've gathered. I had a request to say something a little bit more about that stage. The reason I didn't spend much time on it was twofold. On the one hand, we didn't have much time, and on the other hand, I haven't reached it yet. But when I do, I'll spend some more time in the next lecture. Now, the genital stage is the final stage in Freud's theory of the development of psychosexuality or of personality. And his idea is this is a stage at which we're capable of mature relatedness to other people, as well as our primary sexual aim becomes sexual intercourse and eventually leading, the basic idea behind it is obviously reproduction. So his idea is that we integrate all kinds of childhood notions about sex, childhood feelings about sex, feelings about all the erogenous zones from the oral through the anal through the phallic and the genital, that we bring all those things together in this final genital stage and essentially enjoy all of them. And that for a person who doesn't have some kind of psychosexual problem, you're going to see that the person is not going to be terribly inhibited about sexuality, is going to be able to enjoy closeness with another person, intimacy with another person, as well as to be able to enjoy genital sexuality and intercourse. I might say, though, that I haven't mentioned much about this, and I will shortly, about the role of culture in all of this. And one of the things that happens in psychotherapy is that there are changing concerns that people come in with. And in fact, if you think about the role of culture in Freud's time versus the role of culture in ours, there's been a shift, I think, away from some of the sexual problems that often brought people in to different kinds of relationship and intimacy problems, which is probably, in some ways, it's probably no surprise with the breakdown of a family, the breakdown of extended families, that you're seeing more people having trouble with basic relationship issues that they're coming in for, rather than that they're having symptoms that seem to result from issues related to repression of sexuality or difficulty dealing with their sexual impulses. I mean, just to say something about that the role of culture in what's considered pathological. Years ago, say 50, 60 years ago, you might have seen a patient come into therapy because he or she, the person believed that he or she was perverse in some way because, say, let's take the case of a man who was particularly enjoyed oral sex with his partner. Now, 50, 60 years ago, he may have seen that as a problem. Now someone might come in because their lover is telling them, you're inhibited here because you don't enjoy oral sex. So you can see how things really have changed over time. And many people have argued that there are very significant cultural aspects to what's defined as mental illness or defined as psychopathology. Homosexuality was considered psychopathology officially 20 years ago, no longer is now by the American Psychiatric Association. There are all kinds of these changes that reflect things like changing attitudes in the culture, political issues, so that there clearly is a cultural role to these things as well. With that, I'd now like to get into Freud's last model, and in this lecture I'll talk about Freud's final model and then talk about later developments in psychoanalysis, and then conclude with some thoughts about what are the accomplishments of psychoanalysis and what are some of its limitations. In terms of Freud's last model that we'll talk about, it's called his structural model, in which he argues that the mind has three different structures to it. And by structures, he means sets of different processes that serve different functions. So that, for example, one of those structures is called the id. This is the center of our instincts, the reservoir of our instincts, sex and aggression. This is the side of us that is always pressing for some kind of satisfaction. He believes it is biologically rooted, and that there's nothing we can do about that, in the sense that we will always have these id instincts. The best we can do is to try to channel them in one way or another. Now, often opposed to the id is what he calls the superego. And the superego is essentially our conscience. It's that moral side of ourselves which tells us what's right and wrong. Now, that's in some ways an oversimplification, because it tends to be, according to psychoanalytic theorists, and there's certainly good reason to believe this, the superego starts to arise very, very early, so that many of the values and dicta in the superego, the moral views of right and wrong, are actually shaped when we are very young and when we don't know very much. So that many of the problems that people come in with to psychotherapy from a psychoanalytic perspective, come from the fact that they have a relatively immature superego, or aspects of their superego that are relatively immature. The things that they won't allow themselves to do that they think are wrong. For example, having a nasty thought, an angry thought towards someone important in your life, say towards your mother or your father, or towards you may have grown up believing it's wrong to think bad things about someone you love. That would be an example of a pocket of superego functioning that's fairly childish, and that could lead to real conflict with the id and lead the person to experience some kind of symptom. The superego, according to Freud, develops through identification in childhood. That is, we essentially take in the values of our parents and we make them our own, and they become part of ourselves. It's almost like a conscience sort of sitting on top of our shoulder, which initially has the face of our mother and our father right there with it. It's like this person saying, no, don't do that, or yes, you can do that. And people have the experience throughout their lives of when they're doing something that they think that their mother or their father would not approve of. Even as adults, you'll see people will have the experience of imagining, what would my mother say at this point, or what would my father say at this point, which you can imagine can really inhibit their behavior. For better or for worse. You can see the origins of the superego, and a little child might, for example, be, say even a 2-year-old might walk over to, the child has been told many times, you are not supposed to touch that vase. And that's the perfect thing to tell a child, because the child, of course, at age 2 is going to want to go touch the vase, and preferably to smash it and see what happens. So the child walks over to the vase, and sometimes you'll see that child stop and go, no, don't touch vase. It's a good example of how you can see internalization or identification happening. And when I use the word internalization, what Freud and psychoanalytic theorists mean is that we are essentially taking something that's once external, these views of right and wrong from our parents, and making them part of ourselves, and essentially bringing that external authority inside of our heads. So that's the role of the superego. I might add as well that when Freud didn't use the terms id and superego because he wasn't speaking English. When he developed terms, he actually used some fairly simple terms that he could use with his patients. This was something that has really been emphasized by Bruno Bettelheim, who wrote a book about the way Freud's terms have been translated into English, and particularly into American English and American psychoanalysis. What Freud said when he talked about the id, for example, he called it the it. It's this part of yourself that feels like an it. It doesn't feel like you. And that a patient will sometimes come in feeling like, here I'm doing this thing. That's not me. I don't have that feeling. I don't have that behavior. And he refers to it as that sense of sort of, it's itness. It's something that's not me. The superego, similarly, was described as essentially the above me. It's this thing that sort of stands above me, judging me. And that's really the way he was both thinking about it and speaking with his patients. The third part of the mind, according to the structural model, Freud calls the ego. Well, Freud didn't call the ego. He just called it the I, but we call it the ego in this country. The ego is vested with a number of functions. It's essentially the executive in the brain or in the mind. Basically, it's in charge of selecting choices in various kinds of ways. It's involved in cognition, that is in thought, in perception, in control of our motor behavior. It's essentially the decision-making apparatus in the mind, according to Freud. Aside from those kind of seemingly rational functions which the ego is charged with, there is another set of functions that the ego takes care of, and that is essentially regulating our emotions as well as regulating our impulses. It's involved in preventing ourselves from feeling much psychological pain by using various mechanisms of defense, which involve distortions of reality and of the way we see reality in order to prevent ourselves from feeling negative emotions like anxiety or shame or guilt, or sometimes enhancing positive emotions. For example, positive self-esteem, by convincing ourselves that we are better than we indeed are. I mean, if you ask a random sample of people, are you more intelligent or less intelligent than the average person? The average person will say, I'm more intelligent than the average person. Now, that obviously is statistically impossible. We can't all be more intelligent than the average person. Or if you ask people, rate yourself on how nice you are, and how nice you are in comparison to other people, you'll see the same kind of positive biases in most people. And essentially, you can see that there's a bias towards seeing ourselves as better than we are that is quite persistent, that psychologists have documented empirically in a number of ways. We say something about those mechanisms of defense. These were really codified by Anna Freud, who was Freud's daughter, and was one of the leaders of the psychoanalytic movement for many years until her death about 10 years ago. There are a number of different kinds of defenses that people use. One we've already talked about, that's repression, which is when you essentially block some kind of memory or some kind of thought from consciousness. And you do that to protect yourself from its effects on how you would feel. Another we've talked about already is sublimation, when you essentially take some kind of drive or some kind of basic impulse that would not be socially acceptable, and you channel it in a way that is in turn socially acceptable. You may, for example, have a desire to mate with lots of, suppose you're a male, you have a desire to have sex with lots of women. You find out that being a cameraman is especially conducive to that, and you become a cameraman. That would be an example of sublimation. Though for some of our camera people that wouldn't quite work. So that's one example. Or I gave the example before of boxing, where I obviously have aggressive impulses like everyone else. I don't beat people up. I don't give my students C minuses when they deserve A's. So instead, I watch people beat each up on television. Or actually, I don't pay for closed circuit for this, but so I keep it to television, so it's within manageable bounds, I assure you. That's an example of sublimation. Other defense mechanisms that people routinely use. One is called reaction formation, which is essentially when you take what you really feel and you turn it into its opposite, or you take an impulse and you turn it into its opposite. That if, for example, a good example of a reaction formation might be someone has just ended a relationship with you, and you tell someone that that you didn't care about them anyway. In fact, you think they're kind of disgusting. Now, there's an example where you've just essentially switched your feeling around, and by switching your feeling around, now you're feeling better about it. Freud argues that reaction formation arises during the anal stage, when the child has to switch over from an initial enjoyment of the anal region to now suddenly this is something that's totally disgusting, which happens over a relatively brief period and is indeed quite remarkable if you think about how kids make that kind of transformation, how they entirely switch that around. Another example of reaction formation that you could an arguable one, and I'll give a more thorough example of this in a minute, is of many television evangelists who talk about sex in a way that you know that they have all kinds of prurient interest, and it turns out that they did, but they are talking about sex as if it's something disgusting that who would want to do, and isn't it awful, we really need to fight this thing. That's an example of reaction formation. You'll see as I'm describing these things that they often tend to shade into each other. I mean, all the defenses typically involve some element of repression, or many of them do, because you're often, in order to have reaction formation, in order to turn something into its opposite, you have to first of all repress the fact that you have the feeling in the first place. So it's not as if you can say, oh, I spot this one now, I spot this one now. And the ego, according to psychoanalytic theory, is much more flexible than that. It tailors responses to specific situations and to specific emotions that we're feeling, and is fairly flexible in its use of different kinds of defensive processes at different times. This is simply a list of different kind of processes that psychoanalytic theorists have observed. Another one is projection, which is when we essentially take a feeling or an impulse with which we're not comfortable in ourselves, we project it onto somebody else, and we make them the bearer of it instead, and then we can feel okay about ourselves. Classic examples of that, one theory of homophobia relies on a projection hypothesis. That is, people who are most ardently upset by homosexuals and the people who go out, for example, and physically harass homosexuals. The argument has been made that they are essentially projecting impulses of their own, which may well obviously be in those other people, but they're very uncomfortable with their own homosexual impulses, which they've thoroughly repressed. So instead, they spend their time attacking other people's homosexuality, and that way they can get some kind of satisfaction that I'm fighting off this awful thing that really I feel in myself, but I would never recognize to be part of myself. Some people have argued that scapegoating of various kinds has always involved some element of projection. Some psychologists have argued that that the Nazis made heavy use of projection to project characteristics of themselves that they didn't like onto other groups, and then they would then try to eradicate those other groups as a way of destroying these parts of themselves in some kind of symbolic way. Those would all be examples of projection. I'll mention one or two others. Rationalization is an example of a defense mechanism, which is one with which you're all quite common, not only for having used it many times yourself, I'm sure, but also simply from having observed in others. That's when you essentially convince yourself of a good reason for something when there really wasn't a good reason for it. When you convince yourself that you come up with a rational explanation for which there was really no reason whatsoever. A final example of defenses, and this points up the issue that defenses are not pathological per se, is humor can be used as a defense. I mean, this is one of my favorite defenses. When you're feeling anxious or uncomfortable, an easy way to get around it can be to use humor. And you use these kind of defenses in all kinds of places in your life. I know for myself, I don't always use humor only when I'm anxious, and I should tell you that so you don't. The more I use it, you'll now be thinking, oh, he's really getting anxious now, isn't he? but you can use, these things that get integrated into your personality. They're things that you use not only defensively, but you can also use defensively. And, in psychotherapy, you'll sometimes see patients who have a good sense of humor, who will in turn not only have that sense of humor in an enriching way, but as soon as they start to get to material that's uncomfortable for them, you'll start to see the level of jokes go up. And at that point, as the therapist, you try to point that out and you try to look to see what is happening at this particular point that's making you need to joke so much. On the other hand, that can be a terribly disconcerting thing to do, as any of you know who've ever spoken with a psychologist or psychiatrist or social worker, and you've told them a joke, and instead you've got an analysis instead of a chuckle at the joke. Let me give you an example of how this id-ego-superego model works, and let's take the case of the televangelists. Now, these are people who have, and I won't use specific names since this is going to be on videotape and audio tape, and I, of course, wouldn't want to get sued. That's my ego speaking, by the way, which is involved in this kind of compromise. What Freud would say, or psychoanalytic theorists would say, is that when you see id-ego-superego conflicts, essentially you're going to see compromise formations that are created by the ego. The ego is now, in this model, having to somehow come up with some way of reconciling the demands of the id, sex, aggression, whatever other kinds of wishes. On the other hand, the demands of the superego or conscience saying, no, you can't, no, you can't do that, yes, you can do that, etc. That's wrong, that's right, as well as the demands of reality. What's appropriate in this situation? What can you do without getting yourself in trouble one way or another? One of the best examples, I think, of ego-superego functioning really is in the televangelists, who are people who, it's very funny, I used to give this example years before Jimmy Swaggart and Jim and Tammy got themselves in a lot of trouble. So whoever said that psychoanalysis can't predict anything, the example was of these are people who seem to be, not those specific individuals, but some of the televangelists seem to be particularly conflicted about sexual impulses. They are people who believe that these things in a very fundamental way are wrong. They're opposed to premarital sex, postmarital sex, extramarital sex, intramarital sex, whatever kind of sex it is, they're opposed to it. And you would hypothesize that these are people who are very uncomfortable with their own sexual impulses, and that's probably why they focus on it so much. I mean, why would you be so interested, for example, in the way many of them are in homosexuality? Why is homosexuality on these people's minds so much of the time? Why is extramarital sex on their mind so much of the time? Well, we found out from some of them that it was on their mind for a good reason, which is they were engaging it. But so here are people who are profoundly uncomfortable with their own sexuality. That's the superego speaking. Like the rest of us, they have those centers of the brain, of the nervous system, that are involved in producing sexual urges. They've got to do something with them. And this is one of the, I think, most fundamental contributions of Freud, is that we really do have all kinds of wishes that are biologically based, and that some that are based on learning as well as biology, some that are strictly learned. But we have these wishes and impulses, and they're not inert. Something's going to have to happen with them. So what is the conflict? What is the way that these people resolve this conflict, a severe conflict between the id and the superego? Well, one of the best ways is to go out and essentially attack sexuality in other people, attack all these forms of sexuality you consider deviant. You get to feel like a very moral person. You also at the same time get to focus on sexuality an awful lot. Let me give you an example of this. I heard, I don't remember which of the evangelists did this, but I heard one of them actually brought pornographic material into his church one morning and handed it out to show people what was in the public library. Now, a couple of things about this. One is that the people who are out searching the public library, scouring for pornography in the middle of, of Catcher in the Rye or whatever they're scouring for, these people get to read more titillating passages than you and I ever would in a lifetime. So here they are out doing the Lord's work. I mean, they're out trying to fight the evils of these things yet. So they're satisfying their superego, yet what are they doing? They're getting to satisfy all of their prurient interests at the same time. And how many of you, so then they bring this stuff into church and they're showing it, everybody's, this is awful, amen, hallelujah. I mean, they're reading this stuff, and isn't this terrible stuff? Well, how many of you have ever had the pleasure of reading pornography in the comfort of your own pew? I mean, if you think about it, it's an absolutely wonderful compromise that the ego has come up with between the superego and the id. It's not one that appeared to have worked for many of the televangelists. Many of them seem instead, they still had these urges that they didn't know what to do with, and those did, as in the model that we talked about before, the topographic model of conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, they seem to slip out the back because these were not things that could be comfortably handled with the way the person's ego had essentially created some kind of compromise. So the implications of all this for treatment then is the next question that I'll raise before talking about some developments in psychoanalysis since Freud's time, because psychoanalysis is no longer just Freud's theory. There are a number of people who've been working on this now for 100 years. And for people who dismiss Freud, dismiss psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic forms of treatment on the basis of the idea that they don't like Freud's theory of sex and aggression, that's probably not a very valid thing to do, since psychoanalysis is not Freud's theory of sex and aggression as our basic motives. The basic idea of psychoanalytic treatment is to use insight to help a person change. The idea is that if we are constantly doing things of which we have no awareness, if we've come up with all these unconscious compromises between id and superego, between conflicting motive systems, and these are not things that we have consciousness of, they're things that we often may have developed as we were children, ways of handling reality, ways of dealing with things that are uncomfortable. These things are going to be operating automatically and unconsciously in us all the time. For most of us, most of the time, that's fine. It doesn't get us into any trouble. When it does get us into trouble, what this theory suggests is what you need to do is to get insight into what it is that's going on under there. And that way you can essentially gain conscious control of it. That one of my patients, an adolescent patient, once said, when it became clear to him a very central dynamic in his life in which he was really getting himself into situations in which he was treated badly or not working up to his potential or not treated up to his potential. He finally realized what he was doing, and he had this sort of aha experience, like, this is what I've been doing. And he said, this is really upsetting. I feel like I'm not the captain of my own ship. And I think he put it beautifully, because I think that's exactly what he was describing, that feeling of someone else was at the helm. That someone happened to be him. But it was him essentially at a different time who had developed strategies of dealing with emotions, ways of seeing reality, ways of wishing for things that may well have been appropriate when he was younger. They may well not, but they may well have been appropriate. But they were built on childhood cognition. They were built on his family life at the time. They were built on experiences that were no longer necessarily valid and not applicable to now. The example that I gave before of the sexually abused patient who had repressed the sexual abuse for many years, and it was showing up in symptoms like her inability to have intimate relationships as an adult, or eventually came up as she was starting to develop a sexual relationship in depression and panic attacks. That was an example of a person who you can see the action of the defenses in which she had, as a child, been forced to solve a very difficult problem, and that is, how do you deal with a material that is with memories and things that have happened to you that are emotionally overwhelming. She had dealt with it as best a child can, which is essentially to put it aside, to keep it out of your mind. Now, that's a strategy that was probably about as adaptive a strategies she could come up with at the time. And many adults, in fact, use that kind of strategy when they're faced with some kind of trauma, at least for a while, until that period starts to break down and they're then able to begin working through what has happened to them. But so that was her solution. The problem was, and the analogy that came to my mind at the time was that she was essentially it was as if she had been asked at age 5 to solve a very difficult differential equation and was told, you're now stuck with the answer that you come up with at age 5. You don't know the calculus, but this is going to be your answer from now on. The reason it was her answer from now on was because now it was repressed. Now she had no access to what had happened, and that had been a solution to a problem, but that solution was now a problem itself as she was an adult. And so the aim was then to help her become conscious of what had happened, to help her see how she had tried to resolve it as a child, to help her change that resolution, to come up with a new answer or some newer answers as an adult, particularly in the light of her new knowledge and the cognition she has as an adult, the ability to think she has as an adult, as about things like, will this happen to me in other situations? Is this going to happen in all relationships with men? Was I responsible, etc.? Those kind of questions were at the heart of things she really needed to rework. How she was going to deal with it, how she was going to regulate her emotions. Those were all questions at the heart of how she was going to get over this. And those were things that really required conscious insight for her to be able to do that. So those are basically the principles of psychoanalytically oriented treatment. Psychoanalytically oriented treatment tends to last, typically there are short-term psychotherapies that are psychoanalytically oriented to last usually about 6 months, that are once a week. Most psychoanalytic psychotherapy lasts about, probably my guess is probably about 2 to 4 years. The idea is, and patients sometimes will get very concerned when you tell them when after initial evaluation, what I think you need is this, and it's going to take this amount of time, and they're aghast. They're thinking, you're asking me to come once or twice a week for 4 years. You must think I'm terribly sick. And my typical response to that is, if you think about how long it took to develop this problem, you had years as a child to develop this problem, or in the last however many years if it's a problem that's clear where it came from. If I think it's something that's fairly ingrained, say, what would ever make you think that you're going to get rid of that pattern or that problem in a matter of a few short weeks, or even a matter of a few short months, especially if it's something like like a basic problem in relationships where you are constantly, one time after another, picking the wrong person for yourself, or you're constantly getting into battles with people in your life. There's no reason to believe, and it seems, on the face of it, it doesn't seem very likely that you're going to get rid of something like that in such a short period of time. So the way this treatment works, and that is one basic principle, is getting insight. That occurs through a number of procedures. One of them is free association, where what the patient does, or is expected to do as best as possible, is to say whatever comes to mind. That means you come in once or twice, or in psychoanalysis proper, rather than psychoanalytic psychotherapy, 4 to 5 times a week lying on the couch. But that's not the most practiced form of psychoanalytic psychotherapy now, which is a kind of therapy. The most practiced type is you come once or twice a week and you sit face to face and talk to your therapist. You try your best with free association to say whatever comes to mind. And what you and the therapist look at are not only the structure of thoughts and feelings in your head that emerges from that. How do these things, essentially you're trying to get a picture of the associational networks, those networks of association that connect ideas and thoughts and feelings and wishes, by not simply always consciously directing what's coming to mind, but just letting whatever pops into your head, let that be what comes to mind and what you'll talk about. Typically, that'll be centered around an issue. The patient will often come in and say, look at the problem I'm having again with John, and we'll start talking about John. And the aim then is to talk about whatever comes to mind around that issue. The other thing that you attempt to do as the therapist and patient in that circumstance is to look at the things that you're blocking, or that the patient is blocking at those times. Look at what's called resistances to talking about what's really on the person's mind, which can tell you a lot about the underlying emotions and defenses that are occurring at that time. The paradoxical thing about it is that the therapist, in this process in many ways is like a Sherlock Holmes story. You're busy trying to track down, what is this all about? Where did this symptom come from? Where did this pattern come from? And what can we do now to come up with some kind of solution? The paradoxical thing about it is that the patient is both the sleuth and the prime suspect. Because the patient on the one hand is coming in saying, I want help. Consciously, the person is saying, I want to get rid of this pattern. But unconsciously, this person's mind is booby-trapped. This person is coming up with all kinds of ways to throw I guess you'd say the therapist is probably Sherlock and the patient's consciousness is Watson, but to throw them off the trail and to get them on some other trail so that they won't come closer to the things which are really anxiety-provoking. But once you can get to those anxiety-provoking things, the person may well realize in a moment, or over a course of months, or even a course of years, wait a minute, I'm afraid of something that really I don't need to be afraid of. Why am I running my life this way when I could run it this other way? And that's essentially how the treatment is intended to work. One other aspect of that treatment that many people have argued is that there's something about the relationship per se with a therapist which is curative, regardless of insight. That there's something about being with someone who is empathizing with you, who is listening to you, who is there for you week after week or day after day, who is essentially there for no other purpose other than to try to understand your experience. Something about that appears certainly in many patients to have some strong curative value as well, particularly for people who felt as if they were not empathized that way, in that way when they were younger, so that this is kind of a new experience of what a relationship can be like. Freud described transference reactions in some ways as a new edition of an old conflict, that you essentially are bringing something from the past up again in a new version. You might say that from this perspective, one of the aims of a psychoanalytic form of treatment is to rewrite the last chapter, so that now that you don't keep replaying it over and over and over, and together, the patient and the therapist, the two of you work together to come up with some kind of new resolution that is no longer in the old pattern. Now, where has psychoanalysis gone since Freud's time? One of the earlier developments in psychoanalysis was occurred through the work of people who were called neo-Freudians. They were people who accepted many aspects of Freud's theory, the idea of unconscious processes, the idea of defenses, etc. But at the same time, they differed with Freud in a number of ways. I'll mention 2 or 3 of those. One is that they had, and the major one, I guess, is that they had an expanded view of motivation in their minds. They had a somewhat different view of motivation than Freud. They all essentially rejected Freud's theory that sex is the master motive. They argued that he had focused too much on sex as the basic motive, even probably more basic than aggression in his theory. And what they argued instead is that we have a primary need for relatedness to other people. That is a very central form of motivation that is independent of desires for sensual, physical, or sexual gratification from others. And I think they're absolutely right about that myself. I think that's simply a different motive system. I think it's controlled by different neural structures, and I think it has a different developmental path than does the sexual impulse. So one of their basic arguments, and we'll see how this filtered back into psychoanalytic theory after this, is that we have a primary need for relatedness, and that we can run into all kinds of trouble in the ways that that need for relatedness gets shaped and distorted through our experiences throughout life. So that's one. From an evolutionary perspective, I might add that that makes a lot of sense, that as we'll see shortly when we talk about theories that have focused on this need for relatedness, human infants and young children cannot survive without other people, and we are biologically predisposed to form attachments to other people. And when those things go awry, you do in fact later typically see serious psychopathology or some form of psychopathology that arises out of it. A second broadening of the notion of motivation that the Neo-Freudians suggested was that human beings have a need for a sense of meaning in life that is also independent of sex and aggression. This is another area in which I really do agree with the Neo-Freudians. The idea is that we can have all of our sexual impulses satisfied in one way or another. We can have a lot of our aggressive impulses satisfied. But if you've ever been in a situation where you just didn't feel like things meant anything, like the world didn't have a sense of order to it, like you didn't have values that meant something to you, to which you were committed, that is a profoundly unpleasant state. It's one that people experience at different points in their life. If you've ever had a serious loss in your family of someone who was really the closest person to you or someone who's extremely close to you, you know that there are moments of that sort of existential emptiness that you'll experience of nothing means anything. Why am I doing what I'm bothering doing? What's the ultimate meaning of all this? And I think that's something central that the Neo-Freudians, as well as a group of psychologists known as existential psychologists, argued, that this is a primary aspect of something that we as human beings need. It's probably in some ways an accidental byproduct of the evolution of our neocortex, or of the higher levels of our brain, that we ended up being created with this need to have not only cognitive order, that things seem to have to make sense to us, but also we have all kinds of values and ideals and commitments that we use to make the world sensible. It's very similar to what the anthropologists have argued about. They've called it ethos and worldview. The ethos is sort of a group of ideals that the culture is committed to, and the worldview is a group of cognitive ordering principles by which that culture makes sense of reality, beliefs about what reality is like. When those things are threatened, people experience tremendous difficulty and anxiety. One of the major Neo-Freudians, and someone who is one of the few psychologists who has captured the attention both of psychoanalysts and of academic psychologists who teach at universities, was Erik Erikson. What Erikson has done is to try to develop a theory of what he calls psychosocial stages, as opposed to psychosexual stages that are complementary to Freud's psychosexual stages. His argument is not that we don't have these psychosexual stages. He was a Freudian analyzed by Anna Freud and clearly believed in those things. But he at the same time also felt that they really underemphasized the social side of ourselves, the way in which we develop as social beings who from the very earliest points in our life are having to deal with questions like, do I trust other people? Am I basically trustful or mistrustful of other relationships? Issues like autonomy. Can I be autonomous? Or if I am autonomous, is it going to lead to bad things? Can I, even from the time you're walking on your own feet, can I walk on my 2 feet or am I going to fall? If I run off, am I going to get in some kind of trouble? So he's dealing with some of these broader issues. And Erikson is well known probably among many of you for developing the notion of identity and identity crisis. He's the person who really popularized the conception of an identity crisis, by which he means that kind of sense of loss of or not having a sense of who I am. What is it that I value? What is it that I want? You can see this, it includes a subjective feeling of not knowing really who you are, what you stand for, what you're like from day to day. It includes not having a commitment to specific roles or switching among roles you commit to. Like if you watch adolescents, you'll often see, who are in an identity crisis, you'll often see that they will shift from one role to another by the day, and they'll sort of try on, one day they'll try the role of being punk. Well, that doesn't work after a few months, so they grow their hair out a little longer and they try a different role. And that doesn't work, so they cut their hair a different way and they try it a different role. Those are all examples of identity crisis. The interesting thing about identity crises, and this is one of Erikson's fundamental contributions, and one of the contributions of the Neo-Freudians more generally, is the idea that culture plays a very significant role in shaping us psychologically. That you don't see identity crises in many societies, certainly not on a large scale, particularly societies in which you have rituals, rites of passage, in which adolescents are essentially told, now you are a man, now you are a woman, and are essentially instructed in what it means to be a man or a woman now. You don't see the time of, well, what do I really believe in? Am I into this? No, not really. Am I into this? They simply don't have that kind of leisure, and it's not something that's expected for people to go through in those societies. The interesting thing in teaching introductory psych over the last 10 years, I've typically asked my students when I taught Erickson, how many of you would say you've had an identity crisis? And the thing that's been startling is the changes over the last 10 years. In 1981 or 82, when I first asked the question, roughly, maybe 60% of the students would raise their hands. They were still on the tail end of the 60s and the 70s when it was normative to have a period in which you really questioned authority, you questioned what you were doing, you thought, do I really want to get my MBA now? I mean, those were the kind of questions that you asked. Now, when I ask the same question, probably 10% of the students raise their hands, saying that they've had some kind of identity crisis. Really fits exactly into Erickson's theory, because what he's arguing is we are biological beings, just as Freud said. We have these drives. We have a nervous system that controls our behavior. But we also are creatures of culture, whose lives and whose identities and whose ways of thinking and feeling are fundamentally shaped by the culture. And as that culture changes, the way most of us think, the way most of us feel are going to change, as well as the kinds of psychopathology that emerge are likely to change. Moving now from the neo-Freudians, one of the major I guess I'll mention a couple of other developments in psychoanalysis. One of them is the development of what's called ego psychology. Whereas Freud focused on, it's called ego psychology. Whereas Freud focused on essentially the id psychology. He focused his lifetime mostly on the development of sexuality and of psychosexual stages. And he focused a lot on conflicts involving the id and of how we handle our drives or how we handle our basic wishes. The ego psychologist began looking at a different question, which is how does the ego function? How is it that a normal person, for example, typically deals with how does a person think? How does a person regulate feelings? How does a person solve problems? Those were the kind of questions that the ego psychologists were interested in. They were also interested in patients who had manifest difficulties in doing that. For example, patients who had psychoses, whose egos, that is their ability to regulate their cognition, their thought, their feelings, their impulses, etc., to tell real from not real, to tell inner from outer, to tell when something's a fantasy and when something's real. When those were significantly compromised, the ego psychologists were interested in figuring out exactly what's wrong here. What is happening in this person's thought process? For example, in a person who's schizophrenic. If they are saying things peculiar. The aim was to develop psychological tests that would allow you write down verbatim what the person has said, having looked at a standard stimulus, like a Rorschach ink blot, which is an ink blot. It's an ambiguous shape, and you have to make something up out of it. When you've seen the way 1,000 people respond to that ink blot, you know an idiosyncratic response. When you've got written down exactly what this person said, you can then go back and figure out what exactly has this person done? How has this person veered off? And it gives you a real sense of what's happening in the way their ego is functioning from a psychoanalytic perspective. So those were the kind of things that the ego psychologists were interested in. Probably the major developments in psychoanalysis over the last 20 or 30 years has been the development of what's called object relations theory. Now, object relations is an unfortunate term. It came from Freud's use of the term object, by which he means the object of sexual desire. That is, that we have a person out there who becomes the object of our libido or of our sexual interest or of our love or of our interest in general. So that's where the term object comes from. And object relations essentially means the way we relate to people interpersonally in close relationships and the cognitive, emotional, and motivational processes that underlie that capacity for relatedness. That is, it's dealing with how we think and feel in relationships, how we're motivated to act in relationships, and how we actually behave in intimate relationships. Now, the reason this theory emerged was because psychoanalysts began dealing with patients who had seemingly much more severe problems than conflicts between wishes or impulses on the one hand and superego on the other. These were people who not only had neurotic difficulties of that sort that might create a symptom like they have some kind of anxiety reaction in some situation, or they tend to pick somebody who's not quite right for them, or they feel a little bit bad about themselves. But these therapists and analysts were looking at patients who instead seemed to have some much deeper disturbance, particularly an interpersonal disturbance, in the way they actually attach to people. They might be, for example, in the case of someone who has a paranoid personality. I should introduce the term personality disorder, which is the term that gradually emerged to describe these kind of people and is now the official language of the American Psychiatric Association. A personality disorder refers to an enduring problematic way of feeling, thinking, and behaving that affects the person's occupational functioning and or interpersonal functioning. So these are not just minor problems, or these are not just even fairly major problems like every 3 years you get depressed, but rather these are things that deeply disturb your capacity to have relationships with other people or your capacity to function occupationally in one way or another. So that a patient with a paranoid orientation or paranoid personality disorder may constantly have distrustful expectations of relationships, may think terrible things are going to happen, may have the idea that people are out to get him or out to get her. Even though this person is not psychotic, this person's not totally delusional, the person's basic way of attributing, making inferences about people's attitudes and their feelings and their behavior is off skewed in this paranoid direction. A person with a borderline personality disorder, this is a patient group who in my own research, I've studied fairly extensively, and in particular have studied their object relations. These are people who have trouble maintaining intimate relationships because they tend to split. The major theory, one of the major theories is by a psychoanalyst named Otto Kernberg, who focuses on the way they split their representations of themselves and others into all good and all bad. So that at one time they can feel great about themselves. At another time, they feel now totally bad about themselves. They may be motivated to try to kill themselves. Or they can get into a relationship with someone and very quickly decide, this is the person for me. This is the person I've been looking for. We're not just talking about something that you and I may have done at one particular time. We're talking about a chronic pattern of doing this, that they meet someone, within 3 days, they are totally enraptured by this person. No one else matters. This person is just everything to them. And then suddenly, they shield themselves from anything bad about the person. This person may have some awful habit that they're not seeing at all. I mean, again, this is something that most people do when they start to fall in love, which is that they see people in irrational, unlikely ways, and they forget about all the nasty things the person does. They don't recognize that the person does invade or whatever it is that the person, the idiosyncrasies the person has. But these are people who chronically do this with friends. They do this with lovers. They do this with everyone in their life. Not everyone, but with many people in their lives. They may then, when something comes along that the person in some way acts in a way that appears to them rejecting, they become totally despondent. They now shift over and all they can see is the negative. They say, this person is evil. This person is trying to hurt me. This person is trying to destroy me. And if you say to them, well, a week ago you saw this person is just wonderful. How does this fit together? They say, I never thought that. Or, well, I was totally wrong at the time. And when you hear words like total coming out of these people's mouths, you can often make the diagnosis that they'll often use words like they'll describe people with body parts, and they'll say, this person's a total blank. When they do this repeatedly, you typically know that you often know that you're dealing either with a borderline patient or with an adolescent. With borderline patients, what you see is behavior like wrist cutting. Like they will cut themselves, often in a manipulative way, to get other people to come to their rescue in some ways. Sometimes they're quite serious about trying to kill themselves, and they do have very high suicide rates. Sometimes they'll cut themselves and they'll tell you that the reason for it is they're trying somehow to numb themselves, or that they want to feel something because they don't feel anything, or all they're feeling is this intense psychological pain and they instead want to feel some kind of physical pain to divert themselves from it. This sort of prototypical borderline patient was played by Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction. Now that's a very, very severe example of a borderline patient who's on the edge of psychosis. But that kind of total infatuation and then a loss of some sense of the boundaries of what's appropriate and inappropriate, those are examples of borderline behavior. Though again, I should tell you, there are many lovely people who have borderline personality disorders who are very nice people but who have some deep disturbances in the way they attach. And so I don't want to make it sound as if all these patients are these, awful people like Glenn Close on Fatal Attraction, because they certainly are not. So that's an example of what object relations theorists were trying to look at. And what they're trying to look at is what causes the kind of problems in these people the argument was that the basic problems are not so much in conflicts between id and superego, or between impulses and our moral conscience, but rather the problem is that this person has a problematic way, first of all, of forming representations of people in his or her mind. And by that I mean, the way this person sees other people, the person may, say, split them into good and bad. The person may form representations of people in their mind. That is, images, but images isn't the right word because it includes lots of different kinds of thoughts about other people. The person may form ideas or representations of other people in their minds in which they are expected to be abusive. And in borderline patients, for example, one of our research findings repeatedly has been one of the things that differentiates borderline patients, even those who are severely depressed, from other patients who are severely depressed but not borderline, is the malevolence of their expectations of relationships. They tend to project malevolence into all kinds of situations where they can make an attribution one way or the other. They can make an inference. Why did this person do this? They typically will go in a malevolent direction. And some of the research that we've been doing, we've been finding links not only to early childhood experiences of their earlier attachments and what happened in their first few years of life. Because you often do see a history of disrupted attachments in these patients where for some reason there were massive changes in their caretakers in the first 5 years, or throughout childhood, but especially those first few years. Though there is a connection between disrupted attachments even later. and borderline personality disorder. But in these people, you'll see that is on the one hand. On the other hand, we also often, if we have found in a couple of studies, a relationship between those malevolent representations and a history of abuse, particularly sexual abuse in childhood, which people are now starting to look at in borderline patients, because several research groups have now found elevated incidents of history of sexual abuse in patients with this particular disorder. I'll give you, I guess I'll give you a quick example. No, I guess I don't really have time to give you an example of that. I think I'll wrap up by talking about some of the accomplishments and limitations of psychoanalytic approaches. When a psychoanalytic clinician works with a patient, when a patient comes into for the first time into the therapist's office, there are a number of things that therapist is going to do. The first is to get an assessment of the symptom. What is the symptom? When does it happen? When did it begin? The second is that you then want to rule out biological problems. You want to ask about this person's genetic history. You want to find out about their biological relatives. Did they have similar problems? Is there depression? Is there anxiety in the family? You want to make sure, of course, that this person is also amenable to primarily a talking rather than to a medical therapy. Is this person someone who is experiencing some kind of delusions or hallucinations, in which case you're going to be thinking in more of a biological direction. You'd want to know about this person's history. How does this symptom fit into this person's life history? Where does this person come from? How do I understand what this person's mind is like now, given what I know about this person's history, about the way this person experienced his or her history? A fourth thing that you want to ask about after the symptoms and a biological history and the person's developmental history, you want to essentially get some idea about this person's primary conflicts and defenses. You want to know what's going on under the surface. What is it that's bothering this person, as well as how does this person tend to try to regulate that? And how does this person in general try to regulate their emotions? Finally, you try to get an assessment of their object relations. That is this a person who's capable of intimate relationships? Is this a person who has particular deficits in that respect, or particular conflicts which get in the way of relatedness? Is this a person who avoids relationships entirely because of fears that have developed a long time ago about relationships, that they're somehow threatening, or the things aren't going to work out in them? There is indeed a great deal of evidence now suggesting that the patterns of attachment that you see as early as 12 or 18 months in a laboratory are predictive of social behavior in preschool, in the elementary school years, and we're starting to have some evidence to suggest that these patterns are passed on from generation to generation. Most of the studies have found, particularly the primary caretaker in these studies, which has been the mother, that the way the mother appears to be attached to her own mother or her own parents as an adult is highly predictive of the way her child at 18 months or 6 years will be attached to her, which is just fascinating, the way these things seem to go from generation to generation. So that's the way a psychoanalytic assessment would proceed with a patient. And I think that one of the biggest advantages of psychoanalysis is that it offers a very comprehensive way of thinking about the way a person's mind operates, the way a person's behavior occurs, and the whole context for it. How does it all fit together? A second accomplishment of psychoanalysis is that a number of the key assumptions of psychoanalysis, or arguments of psychoanalysis, do appear in light of the best empirical data that we have now to have been true. One is the idea that patterns of relatedness developed early in childhood tend to express themselves or to continue throughout adulthood. Another is that we have many unconscious processes, defense and defenses. Another is the focus on the role of representations of ourself and others in psychopathology, as well as in normal psychological functioning. I'll mention one final thing about accomplishment of Freud, and that is Freud broke down the them-us distinction in mental health. His argument is that we all are to some degree neurotic, that the most normal of us are to some degree neurotic, and that's because we were all children once. We all had to cope with growing up at a time when we didn't have adult faculties. We didn't have adult ways of thinking and feeling. We didn't know what we were going to be confronting when we were older, and we essentially adapted ourselves as best we could to the environment in which we found ourselves. For most of us, most of the time, that's just fine. For many of us, some of the time, it's not just fine. And one of the things that a practical side effect of this idea that it's not like there are those crazies out there and then there's us normal people. One of the nice sides of it is that it has meant that over the last several years, there's been a real shift so that some of the stigma of seeking treatment when something's going wrong, when you're feeling a little depressed, when you've got some kind of anxiety problem, when you're having some trouble with relationships, that stigma has really dropped off. So that in many places, I suspect Washington, D.C. is one of them, a very high percentage of people see therapists. And I think this is a good thing for a couple of reasons. One is it means that people don't have to live with enduring problems, and the other is that it's great for psychotherapists like myself. In the next lecture, we'll pick up with the limits of psychoanalysis and move on to the major alternative approach.